January 17th, 1944. Truck Lagoon, Caroline Islands. The morning sun climbs slowly over the glassy waters of the Pacific, casting long shadows across the deck of the Japanese aircraft carrier Zukaku. Commander Toshikazu Omai stands at the railing, his hands gripping cold metal as he watches American reconnaissance planes, tiny silver specks, vanish into the clouds. He counts them. 4, then 6, then too many to track. The air smells of salt and engine oil. Somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of American task forces reverberates through the water itself, a sound that has become as familiar as breathing. Omai closes his eyes. He remembers a different time, a different ocean. Pearl Harbor, December 1941, when Japan's carriers ruled the seas, when the element of surprise belonged to them, when American naval power seemed crippled beyond repair. He remembers the intelligence reports that followed. Lexington sunk at Coral Sea, Yorktown destroyed at Midway, Wasp torpedoed near Guadalcanal, Hornet lost in the Santa Cruz Islands. 4 American fleet carriers eliminated within a single year. The mathematics seemed clear then, inevitable. Japan would dominate the Pacific for a decade, perhaps longer. It takes years to build a carrier. Everyone knew this. But now, standing here in early 1944, Omai stares at intelligence photographs spread across a makeshift table. His hands tremble slightly. The images show not 4 American carriers, not 6, not even 8, 17. 17 fleet and light carriers operational in the Pacific theater alone. He checks the dates again, certain there must be an error. There is no error. The Japanese Imperial Navy had entered the war with 10 carriers, the product of 2 decades of naval construction and national investment. Each vessel represented countless hours of labor, miles of steel, the expertise of master shipbuilders who had trained their entire lives for such work. When the Shoho went down at Coral Sea, when the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu burned at Midway, each loss felt like losing a limb, irreplaceable. The industrial capacity simply did not exist to rebuild quickly. By 1944, Japan possessed 6 operational carriers, 6 where there had been 10. The mathematics of attrition seemed to favor Japan's survival, if not its victory. Bleed the Americans, make every island costly, sink their carriers faster than they can replace them. This was the strategy. This was the hope. But the Americans were not playing by the same rules of mathematics. In the shipyards of Newport News, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Philadelphia, and Norfolk, something unprecedented was occurring. The Essex-class carriers, massive fleet carriers displacing over 27,000 tons, were sliding down construction ways at a pace that defied every known principle of naval engineering. The Essex herself, commissioned in December 1942. Yorktown II, commissioned in April 1943, bearing the name of her fallen predecessor like a promise of resurrection. Intrepid, Hornet II, Franklin, Lexington II. The names of the dead returned to haunt the Pacific, faster than Japan could sink them.
But it was not merely the fleet carriers. The Americans had done something the Japanese command had never anticipated. They had industrialized carrier production itself. The Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls, began appearing in 1943 at a rate of nearly 1 per month. Smaller, faster to build, yet each capable of carrying 30 aircraft. Then came the escort carriers, Casablanca-class vessels produced by Kaiser Shipbuilding using assembly line techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. 50 escort carriers launched in less than 2 years. 50. Henry Kaiser's workers were completing a carrier haul every 5 days. The Japanese intelligence officers who reported these numbers were accused of defeatism, of exaggeration, of spreading enemy propaganda. No nation could build warships like automobiles. It was impossible. Until it was not. Commander Omai had fought at Midway. He had witnessed the deaths of Japan's finest pilots, men who had trained for years, irreplaceable artists of aerial combat. He knew what each loss meant. But the Americans were replacing their pilots as quickly as their carriers. Flight schools across the American mainland were graduating thousands of naval aviators annually, young men who learned to fly on a production schedule as ruthless and efficient as the ships they would serve on. The symbolic weight of it all manifested in something as simple as food. When Japanese submarines managed to capture American sailors, the provisions found aboard rescue rafts told their own story. Chocolate bars, canned fruit, cigarettes, coffee. Not survival rations, abundance rations. The Americans provisioned even their emergency supplies with more luxury than Japanese officers received in their standard meals. One captured American pilot interrogated in Rabaul spoke casually of the meals aboard his carrier: steak, ice cream, fresh bread daily. The Japanese interrogator noted this in his report with the clinical detachment of a man documenting evidence of an alien civilization. How does one defeat an enemy that feeds ice cream to its sailors while its factories produce a carrier every week? The ideological foundation began to crack. Japanese doctrine had emphasized spirit over material, willpower over industrial capacity. Bushido, the warrior's code, would triumph over American softness and materialism. But here was the terrible paradox. The soft, materialistic Americans were outproducing Japan 50-1 while simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war against both Japan and Germany. The abundance that was supposed to indicate weakness instead fueled an unstoppable industrial tsunami. By mid-1944, American carrier task forces roamed the Pacific with impunity. When Japan managed to damage a carrier, two more appeared to replace it. The Franklin, bombed and burning off the Philippines, limped back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. Before she reached dry dock, 3 new carriers had joined the fleet. The battle of attrition Japan had hoped to win became a mathematical horror. For every carrier Japan built, America built 20. For every pilot Japan trained, America trained 50.
Commander Omai would survive the war. In 1946, touring the ruins of Tokyo, he would pass by the skeletal remains of what had been planned as a shipyard expansion, a project abandoned in 1943 when steel ran out, when the raw materials could no longer be imported, when the industrial base that had seemed so formidable in 1941 revealed itself as a fragile thing compared to the sleeping giant it had awakened. He would remember standing on the deck of the Zuikaku, counting American planes in the sky, understanding for the first time that this war had never been about courage or spirit or tactical brilliance. It had been about shipyards in Virginia launching carriers faster than Japan could comprehend, about a nation that could afford to put ice cream machines on warships because abundance was not a luxury but a weapon. The Americans had not simply replaced their carriers. They had revealed the distance between two worlds, one built on scarcity and sacrifice, the other on an industrial capacity so vast it treated aircraft carriers as consumable goods. In that gap between worlds, Japan's defeat had been written long before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. The ships were just the messengers.